to discuss American policy towards Tunisia. You might ask, why is a Senate subcommittee that has jurisdiction over nearly a third of the world holding a hearing on a country that's just a little bit bigger than Indiana? The answer is pretty simple. Tunisia is a country that for a long time showed what was possible in the Middle East and North Africa. It was a country that had seemingly gotten it right and was able to stay on a democratic path while transitions faltered in Egypt and Libya and Yemen. Tunisia drafted a new constitution, held multiple free and fair elections. After a really high-profile series of terrorist attacks, Tunisian security forces, with the support of the United States, increased their capacity to protect the country, but also balance protecting civil liberties. Civil society groups, independent media proliferated, exercising their newfound rights to hold Tunisia's leaders accountable. But amidst all of this progress, institutional reforms and accountability initiatives, they really stalled and economic conditions worsened. Widespread corruption persisted, public services got worse, there was police brutality left and right, and the political elites were just squabbling. It ended up being a pretty terrible advertisement for democracy. Tunisian people saw what democracy looked like, and they didn't love it. It was in this context that President Kais Saied promised Tunisians that he was going to fix this mess that many Tunisians had grown really tired of. When I first met President Saied in Tunisia in August of 2021, he told me and our delegation that his intent was not to get rid of democracy, but that he was just going to fix the problem of Tunisia having adopted the wrong kind of democracy, the wrong model, and he was just going to bring a model that worked. But I'm going to be honest, in that same meeting, I saw all the trappings of a despot in waiting. President Saied was self-adulating, saying that he was the only one pure enough to lead. Everybody else was tainted and corrupt. He was conspiratorial about dark enemies he saw around every corner. He bristled at public criticism, telling me no less than 3 times that his seizure of power was not a coup. I left that meeting pretty convinced that Tunisia was likely headed in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, over the last 21 months, my worst fears have borne to be true. Since that meeting, President Saied has followed a dictator's handbook, almost to the letter, disbanding parliament, writing a new constitution that consolidates his power, disbanding judicial independence and employing military tribunals, arresting members of the opposition, including just recently this week, treason charges for the leader of the primary opposition. These are not the actions of a leader who intends to restore democracy just under a different model. Over the last 21 months that President Saied has been steadily dismantling Tunisian democracy, the U.S. policy, unfortunately, has been hesitant. I would argue that it's been half-hearted and often naive. By failing to draw hard lines in the sand, Saied has felt confident in taking one step after another to consolidate power and ignore polite requests from American diplomats to change course. We're talking about Tunisia and only Tunisia today because I would argue that this is a place for the United States to correct course when it comes to our tendency to talk a tough game on human rights and democracy, but then not really lead by example. We cut deals with dictators. We sell billions of dollars of weapons to dangerous autocrats. We send regular signals that there are few consequences for your political and economic relationship with the United States if you move from democracy to repression. And so I argue that this is a hearing in which, through the prism of Tunisia policy, we can also talk about how we can't afford this duality, talk tough but act often too weakly on human rights and democracy. So we're going to ask these questions today, how we can adjust our assistance policies so that we are supporting the Tunisian people and their ability to speak freely and to hold their leaders accountable. We're going to ask how we can empower our diplomats to do that work inside Tunisia. But lastly, I hope that we are also going to talk about China. Because anytime that I argue that we should be reforming our partnerships with dictators in the region, whether it be Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, or Tunisia. The counter that I often hear is that, well, if we don't extend that hand, no matter how repressive the regime is, China's going to fill the void. But I think we have to realize that not everything is a zero-sum game in our competition with China, and that we don't have to make deeper commitments to authoritarians just because China is making a competing offer. I think the best way to compete with China is not to try to beat China in a race to the human rights bottom. If China can only do deep economic deals with countries in which the IMF deems to be unbankable, that's a pretty bad long-term prospect for Chinese economic diplomacy. And so I would argue that Tunisia is a critical test case to change tack and to back up our words with actions. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion with our very able guests today. With that, I'll turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to help us shed a light on the erosion of democratic institutions in Tunisia and the rise, once again, of authoritarian regimes in that country. I greatly appreciate your participation. Ms. Doherty, I know we've had an opportunity to work together when you were with Mercy Corps. Thank you for serving our country in this capacity. And Mr. Harris, thank you for your career service of the State Department and our country. As the Biden administration is proud to point out its defense of democracy in places such as Ukraine, I can't help but observe its noticeable silence in other key areas, such as the Biden administration failing to mention the resistance in Myanmar to the military junta during its recent summit for democracy, and failing to respond to the authoritarians in Tunisia, which is what we're here to discuss today. Following the Tunisian revolution in 2011, when the people rose up against corruption and the lack of freedoms in their country, they inspired actions that sought to bring democracy to Tunisia and inspired the Arab Spring, which swept across the Arab world. However, since 2019, President Sa'id has increasingly tightened his grip on power. In recent weeks, he's dismantled institutional checks and balances, developed a new constitution, and taken Tunisia back in an authoritarian direction. Today, I hope we hear from our witnesses what actions, not just words, that we're going to see from the administration to meaningfully counter Tunisia's current trajectory. While I'm sure our witnesses will point to the reductions for Tunisia and the president's budget request to Congress, I don't think we should be naive enough to think that minor budgetary reductions will be sufficient to get the attention of President Sa'id. Of course, this conversation is complicated by Tunisia's support for our counterterrorism activities in North Africa, which in my view is precisely why we must get the government back into a place of better behavior. The urgency of reversing this erosion of democratic institutions couldn't be more relevant to our own national security. As with other topics and geographies that we've discussed in this subcommittee, China's again present in Tunisia. Beijing, of course, doesn't reinforce any of these messages about democratic backsliding or protecting institutions. The authoritarians in Tunis are happy to welcome Huawei into their system and are also partnering on various R&D partnerships with Beijing. All of this points to a deeply uncertain future for the Tunisian people. President Sa'id may attempt to blame others, but the people of Tunisia must know that their troubles are a direct result of the failures of their own government. While the Tunisian people have risen up before, I pray that they won't have to rise up again. If we're able to work together with our like-minded partners, I'm confident that we can help bring the government back into a better behavior. Again, I'm pleased that we are here to discuss such an important issue, and I look forward to the conversation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Young. Let me now introduce our witnesses. First, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Joshua Harris, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for North Africa in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, previously served as Director for North African Affairs at the NSC, as well as holding other positions in the State Department in Libya, Tunisia, Iraq, Slovenia, and Croatia. Also joining us today is Ms. Megan Doherty. Senator Young mentioned her service at Mercy Corps and NDI, but she also has held positions at the National Security Council and the State Department working in the Middle East and North Africa. She is here in her capacity as Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for the Middle East at USAID. I'll hand the floor over to both of you for your opening comments, and then we'll engage in a discussion. Thank you very much.